You enjoying your pie?
All pie is good pie.
In this video, we're going to be reviewing the new Netflix original comedy, Hitman. Be aware that there will be spoilers, as we'll be reviewing the plot, the positives, negatives of the film itself, and negatives of the meta. First, the plot. Hitman is one of Netflix's most watched films in the US and UK as of early June 2024. It very loosely follows the unusual escapades of real-life undercover police operator Gary Johnson. And don't worry, we'll be sure to circle back to this very loosely allusion later.
We'll circle back with you directly. I'll circle back with you.
It stars Glenn Powell as Johnson and Adria Arjona as his love interest, Madison. Gary is a mild-mannered psychology and philosophy professor at the University of New Orleans who makes an unexpected transition from moonlighting as a police technician to moonlighting as an undercover hitman to catch would-be murderer hirers. This transition occurs after the rough-around-the-edges and potentially corrupt cop Jasper, played by Austin Emilio, gets suspended from his role for roughing up some teenagers. We're not given any further details on this, despite its relevance not just to the plot, but even more importantly to our understanding of Jasper's character. We don't know whether these kids were bad or not.
I need you to shoot some kids. No, shoot kids! These are really bad kids.
But once again, we'll return to this later. Gary and his colleagues quickly learn that he has a knack for undercover work, and so he continues on, developing different hitman personas to fit the expectations of the client, switching from suave, secret agent-like characters for the more wide-eyed fantasist clients, to a redneck brutalist for the more headstrong, red-faced, just-kick-the-shit-out-of-him hillbilly clients. After dozens of hitman hiring meetups, Gary meets Madison, a seemingly timid, abused, and I guess you could say somewhat attractive client who wants Gary, or rather his cooler hitman persona Ron, to kill her husband, whom she says has her trapped and abused in their marriage. Ron, rather than accepting the request and gathering evidence for the surveilling police lying in wait in the van outside, this time decides his course of action using the smaller head located further south than the one on his shoulders. After some flirting, Ron convinces Madison to use the money to get herself a new apartment rather than to use it for murdering her spouse. Admittedly, it does seem like a sensible first move, maybe Ron's onto something, but we'll return to Madison's complete lack of sanity and morality later. So, Gary continues dressing up as Ron and begins dating Madison. Let's be honest, can we blame him? And after a sex montage that's all too brief, things quickly take a downward turn, with the couple running to both Jasper the crooked cop and Madison's husband, whom Ron has to pull a gun on to prevent a physical confrontation. During the latter interaction, Madison is, let's say, nonchalant about the gun pulling.
Hey, you ungrateful bitch! Come here! Shit!
Apologize, motherfucker.
Yeah, he said apologize, motherfucker! He's a professional, you'll do it. Show him.
Although, if we're being honest, the name Madison doesn't really do it any justice. Something like Santanico Pandemonium might be more appropriate.
The mistress of the macabre. The epitome of evil. Santanico Pandemonium!
The decline then escalates even further as the husband tries to enlist Ron's services to kill Madison before turning up dead himself just a few days later. No prizes for guessing who the killer is. And what's more, Jasper suspects the involvement of Madison, which in turn potentially implicates Gary in the crime. This is a classic example of an innocent man attempting to climb too high up through the treacherous terrain of Hot Crazy Mountain. But Gary goes further than this, and rather than hop off the mountain and turn Madison in, he agrees to keep her murder a secret and even help cover her up from the police to save both himself and her. They initially do a decent job of throwing the police off their trail. That is until Jasper, who by the way is not only the only cop in the film with more than 2 neurons to rub together, but also the only other actual character in the film, well, he comes calling for some hush money. But rather than backing down and giving Jasper what he wants, Madison's first reaction is, obviously, to kill him.
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
In fact, Madison's entire MO seems to be kill first, ask questions later. Now, this is fine because we already know Madison is a lunatic, but what isn't fine is what happens next. Gary sees Jasper gasping for air as he struggles to fight for breath against the asphyxiating effects of the poison slipped into his beer by Madison, but rather than calling the police and subduing the photogenic Annie Wilkes, he instead decides to lend a hand. He calmly ties a plastic bag around Jasper's head and watches him suffocate. It's an odd choice character-wise, as it's not as if our protagonist is attempting to quicken Jasper's inevitable demise in order to reduce the duration of his suffering, as he has no idea how fast-acting the poison is or even if it'll actually kill him. Oh, and then seconds later, he and Madison also have sex just feet away from Jasper's dying body. That's probably also important to mention. We then pick up years later with Madison and Gary, who's now living life as a so-called cocktail of himself and Ron, clearly having escaped scot-free as they live a perfectly happy suburban life raising their 2 kids. At the close, their eldest asks how they met, and they stare into each other's eyes with knowing smiles and recount the PG version. They all live happily ever after. Or at least that's how the scene plays out, and how at least some of the audience view this ending, but we'll break this down in more detail later. First, let's get the relatively minor amount of praise out of the way. Glen Powell is quite charming and likeable as the protagonist, offering a distinct cadre of wacky characters, including a, I'd imagine, purposeful, over-the-top imitation of Christian Bale's Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. The key duality we observe as an audience throughout the film is one between the nerdy Gary and his much more suave persona Ron. This Gary and Ron. Powell does a sound job at portraying his transformations between the duo, altering his tone of voice, eye contact and body language, so the audience can easily distinguish between the two, at least initially, before the cooler traits of Ron begin to infest and embed themselves into Gary's psyche, causing his colleagues and college students to view him differently, better, even in contexts in which Ron shouldn't exist. In addition to Powell's portrayal, Austin Emilio does a good job as the corrupt cop Jasper, and he actually provides the funniest scene in the film, which we'll come back to. Finally, Adria Arjona turns in a good performance as the seductive yet deranged Madison. It also doesn't hurt that she's not completely disgusting. Honestly, you can't even blame Gary at this point. I wouldn't have been able to play it nearly that cool.
She beautiful? Shake them for her.
There are also some nice shots, and the film has a pleasing, warm palette throughout. And that's pretty much it for the positives.
That's it? That's all you wrote? You're the worst writer in the whole world!
Next, we're going to look at negatives of the film itself. The negatives are, unfortunately, much more numerous and more prominent. First off, while the entire hook of the film, an undercover agent who artfully assumes different identities in a chameleon-like fashion to catch criminals, is an interesting one, and is rife for comedic hijinks, we don't actually get to see any of it. Other than a montage, half of which we already see in the trailer, we get nothing other than Gary's transition into Ron. It's the equivalent of if Liar Liar came out in 1997, but in this timeline we get the son's wish followed by a brief montage of Fletcher being unable to lie in trivial situations that never come up again with people that are entirely irrelevant to the plot. What's more, in this cursed timeline version, Fletcher would not only not learn the valuable lesson that family is the most important thing in the world to him and that line should be used sparingly rather than as a first thought, but he'd actually learn the opposite lesson, becoming a much worse person by the end of the film. In fact, a single comparative example just doesn't seem strong enough to show just how poorly constructed this film is. So to prove a point, and since I've already got Jim Carrey on the brain, let's stick to the theme of silly 90s Jim Carrey films and showing why Hitman's hook just does not work. In his 94 film, The Mask, Carrey's Stanley Ipkiss is a sheepish, repressed flunky working a dead-end job, a man that never takes any chances. That is before he stumbles across the god of mischief Loki's mask. The mask grants Stanley the god's powers as well as his penchant for causing trouble, which is expressed through the lens of excavating the repressed desires of its user. Initially compelled into this new world of powers and magic as an escape from his mundane life, Stanley moves through his wacky adventure phase into the trials and tribulations phase, eventually coming out the other side a better man with a better understanding that life is what you make of it, mask not required. Now, we could go crazy and follow Jim Carrey into the 2000s with the likes of Bruce Almighty and Yes Man, and honestly it would be more fun than discussing Hitman, but I think we've belaboured the point enough. In all of these films, the basic premise is essentially a romantic comedy with a unique hook, with the difference being that in all of the much better Jim Carrey films that we have hooks that are directly relevant to the story, progressing both the plot and the characters, causing trials and tribulations which force our protagonist to change and grow and become a better person. In Hitman, however, the hook fails on several levels. First, although it's an interesting concept, it's simply not utilised or explored in any depth. We get more range and depth when Roger the Alien chooses his bounty hunter personas.
What the? You poached my bear!
What we see in the trailer of Gary's personas is essentially what we get in the film. Ultimately, it's a gimmick. It's a gimmick they used for advertising the film, rather than an actual plot device relevant to the story or its characters. Secondly, the persona shtick doesn't actually seem to alter Gary's perception of himself or life all that much at all, at least not that the film reveals to us. Whereas the lie-based wish allows Fletcher to realise his over-reliance on lies, and the mask allows Stanley to finally understand that there's a balance to be had between fulfilling duty and desire, Gary's persona switching spares no such epiphany. He turns into a terrible person, sure, but we don't really know why. Rather, it's used only superficially by Gary as a pickup tool. He might have saved himself the trouble and just paid a pickup artist to teach him about the art of negging.
Hello there, my brothers. I almost didn't see you. I am the Prince of Persuasion. Insult your princess. Insult her face, her body, her brain, her car.
Finally, and most importantly, it's just not fun. Hitman is billed as a dark romantic action comedy, but while it certainly contains dark romanticism, having watched this pretty closely, I can unequivocally say that there's no comedy to be found. At least, not any that's actually funny. Honestly, I think Jasper's theatrical reveal to Gary that he knows what he's up to is the most humorous scene.
What are you doing?
Oh, I'm looking for the boyfriend. Oh, shit, I found him. Fuck. I'm good.
Ha
Yeah, you notice how I use the phrase most humorous and not funny? That's because although the scene is closest to being funny, it still doesn't reach the heady heights of actually being funny. So, if Gary nor Ron are funny, and Madison is just an attractive psychopath, and our main man Jasper just blew his load on the scene we've just watched, where do we go for our comedy? Well, Powell and Linklater have an answer up their sleeve in the form of the best comedy duo since the two Ronnies.
4 candles. 4 candles. Here you are. 4 candles. No, 4 candles. Well, there you are, 4 candles. No, 4 candles. Handles for forks.
So meet, bear with me while I look up the names. Claudette and Phil? Wait, Phil? Yeah, okay, I suppose he has got a certain Philishness about him. Sorry, anyway. So C&P are the powerhouses of the comedy cell in Hitman, and since none of the other characters are actually funny, Powell and Linklater are clearly relying on them to take up the comedic slack.
I would get blackout drunk with Ron.
I'd let him talk me into ripping lines on the way to Vegas.
I would rip my IUD out for Ron.
Moving on. There are also problems which at first glance appear minor, but which nevertheless cause quite major problems for either plot, world building, character, or all of the above. For example, when Madison first attempts to acquire Ron's services, she states that she's so scared of her husband, who controls her to such an extent that she's not allowed to work, she views her home as a prison, and he even dictates what she eats, that she feels murder is her only way out. Not an unreasonable position in my book. I mean, if he has such complete and total control over her life that she can't even... Oh, wait. She just leaves him and gets herself a new house and a new life while living in the same city, what seems to be just a few weeks or at most months after she tried to have him killed. I mean, he's not exactly Joseph Fritzl, is he? Clearly, she's never even attempted to get a divorce. Her first instinct was to just end him. What's more, his total dominion over her life apparently doesn't extend to money. She brings cash to hire Ron, what looks like a few grand in an envelope, and after she gets divorced, she moves into what looks to me like a swanky new house. Oh, and by the way, we found out later she's actually lying about being divorced. They're just separated, but we never really found out why that is. But my money is on the fact that Madison knows she'll outlive her hubby and rake in the life insurance, which we'll return to shortly. Now, regarding the house, maybe it's just my British bias, as our houses are comically small. But I mean, look at this place. I'd live here any day of the week. Madison says she's moved to St. Roch, which after some sleuthing doesn't seem to be the best area.
Roll him up.
Anyway, presuming my brief bit of research is accurate, and if anyone watching is actually familiar with the St. Roch area, please feel free to let us know in the comments. Then the crime-ridden reality of the real St. Roch doesn't seem to operate in the same way in Hitman's reality. Just look at these streets. It doesn't exactly look like gang territory. So, either St. Roch in Hitman is an entirely different place, an upscale neighbourhood which doesn't reflect the real St. Roch at all, in which case the question needs to be asked why the writers didn't just choose the name of an upscale neighbourhood to begin with. Or else it's still meant to reflect the real-life crime-ridden St. Roch, but the filmmakers have just done such an immeasurably terrible job at conveying the downtrodden area that it calls into question whether any message the filmmakers transmit actually comes through the way they intended. This is a point we'll return to, as I think it tarnishes the entire film, but first, regardless of whether St. Roch is supposed to be upscale or poor. From where did Madison get the money to live anywhere at all? Savings? We know from Gary's research that
Short stints hairdressing, flight attendant, married to husband Ray Masters, works in his family's oil and gas business. Then, nothing.
Which to my ears doesn't sound like a high-flying career woman. So how much could she have possibly saved? This may seem like a nitpick, but this is basic world building and it's all wrong. Either Madison was so controlled that she couldn't fend for herself at all, and if she doesn't have access to her own food, it seems likely that she doesn't have access to her own money. Meaning that even if St. Roch is a poor neighbourhood, which again it is in real life but seems to be the opposite in the film, where did the money come from for months of rent? And if she always had access to money and was able to leave, then why did she want to kill her husband so she could supposedly escape his clutches? This is a major fault of world building and character work, so let's dive a little deeper. Madison is introduced to us as an imprisoned and abused housewife who sees no way out but to hire a hitman. But as we've just established, she was able to leave her husband anytime she wanted, with access to enough funds to build a new life without even having to find a job. And what's more, she's able to buy all the sex costumes she likes. Sorry, I just wanted an excuse to show that clip again. You're welcome. Oh, and that diet she was being force-fed? Gary runs through her social media accounts and finds pictures from 5 years prior with no visible change to Madison's figure whatsoever, suggesting that her diet can't have been restricted that much. What's that? What if the husband had her on the diet since they first met? Well, again, we know she was free to leave whenever she wanted, so if you met a partner who immediately set you on a diet, would you not just leave? What's more, not only does Madison choose to date a man she believes kills people for money, but she also does this when she runs into her ex.
Shit! Apologize, motherfucker.
Yeah, he said apologize, motherfucker. He's a professional, you'll do it. Show him.
Later that night, she calls this her best date ever. Was Madison ever actually a victim? I mean, sure, her husband's an arsehole, and he even tries to hire one of Gary's personas to kill Madison and Ron. But this is only after Madison literally asks her new boyfriend to point-blank shoot her husband dead in the street. Obviously, this is no excuse, but the point I'm making here is that at this point in the film, they're at least as bad as each other, and we have absolutely no way of knowing whether he's the abusive spouse he's being made out to be. Madison lies consistently and passionately enough that we're forced to question everything she says, and on this point is where the cracks in the character show. We never actually know whether Madison was a traumatised victim who overreacted in her grief and frustration, or a maniacally murderous psychopath who'll say and do anything to get what she wants. And I don't think this is by design in some Joker-esque confusion of realities or cynical manipulation of the protagonist kind of way that we get in Memento. It's just poorly written. Unfortunately, similar problems exist for Gary. Powell and Linklater want to convey ambiguous complexity in the notion of identity, which they showcase in Gary's university lectures centering around this topic for most of the film, which admittedly is a neat device for which they deserve some credit. The problem is that this is at best a surface level exploration of the concept of identity, with no real impact on the story or the character. A fair rebuttal would go something like,
but Gary's transition to Ron is what caused him to kill Jasper. That's directly relevant to the story and the character.
But why does this transition occur? Going back to our 90s masterpieces of Liar Liar and The Mask, we know that Fletcher learns the valuable, if straightforward, lesson about the consequences of lies on not only his family, but also himself, while Stanley learns the value of not repressing his inner desires. What, if anything, does Gary learn? What change occurs in his inner life as he inhabits Ron's persona? Externally, Gary transitions from non-killer to psychosexual murderer, but why? Is it that Gary was always prone to murderous tendencies and Ron just allowed him to express himself? Or was it that Madison brought it out in him? Or was it that his core personality actually really changed from mild-mannered professor to murderous lunatic? And if so, why? And how? Let's not forget that Gary's transition is not subtle, it's extreme. He doesn't simply learn a valuable lesson or learn how to live his best life. He tortures and murders a man he's worked with for years before having sex next to his dying body. I get the feeling that the writers think they've done enough to explain his transition via the scattering of university monologues, but this is in no way true. I've genuinely no idea what Gary's mental state is in any given scene, which is quite something when you consider that Gary actually narrates the entire film.
I know on the surface, my life looks simple, a little plain.
Lois had always been full of energy and life, but lately I had begun to grow more aware of her aging. The bright, exuberant eyes that I had fallen in love with were now beginning to grow dull and listless with the long fatigue of a weary life. I awoke several hours later in a daze.
Overall, the sketchy examples of Madison's house and claims of imprisonment, as well as the overall conveyance of our, I suppose, protagonists, means that I was in a state of constant confusion while watching Hitman. Just when I thought I'd figured out what the writers wanted me to think about a certain character or event, they'd pull a 180 on me just a few scenes later. The inability of the writers to adequately and consistently portray the emotions and drives of the characters is wild, but it also extends to the overall tone of the film. Again, Hitman is billed as a dark romantic comedy, and there are various ways in which this genre of dark comedy can be accomplished, with emphasis on dark. One way is to have neutral or good characters experience dark events outside of their control, such as in the movies The Fundamentals of Cain, or So I Married an Axe Murderer, where we the audience are rooting for our protagonists. Another way is to have bad characters actively participate in and usually even cause the dark events which occur, such as in the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where we the audience know our protagonists are the bad people and we're just along for the absurdist ride, knowing the gang's plot will eventually blow up in their faces, and deservedly so. Often what we see in the same style, for example in a film like In Bruges, in addition to It's Always Sunny, is that our awful protagonists are often awful to the people who are even worse than they are, which helps soften the blow a bit. And in instances where they're awful to good or neutral people, they usually get a comeuppance. And finally, there are dark comedies like Little Miss Sunshine and The Way, Way Back, in which we get a range of moralities and personalities amongst the characters, from the arsehole stepdad, to the strange but well-meaning granddad, to the principal but odd older brother, and hapless but witty stand-in father figure, to a loving mother who's just overwhelmed and struggling. We see a complex interaction between these characters, most of whom are fighting their own personal demons while also struggling to survive a family vacation. And the dark events arise both from within the characters' own decisions and foibles, as well as from events outside of their control. Our protagonists learn and grow throughout their adventures, and we root for them and are happy to see them come out the other side better people. No, this is not an exhaustive list, but you get the idea. But with Hitman, none of these structures or tones apply. Regarding the first type, Madison and Gary are not good or even neutral, they're monsters. Even if you believe the people they murdered were assholes, let's not forget the small detail of them having sex in the same room as their murder victim just seconds after killing him. This is not some violent hijinks, it's Jaime and Cersei Lannister type shit. Hitman also doesn't fit into the third type, as the characters are not complex and ever evolving. As we've covered earlier, they're simply shallow and confused. The closest match is type 2, with our protagonists clearly being mentally disturbed violent criminals, which fits in with the likes of In Bruges, but in Bruges, Colin Farrell's character is deeply depressed because he knows he's a terrible person who's done awful things. With Hitman, Gary and Madison actually think they're good people who are simply defending themselves from bad people, but Gary and Madison are clearly more evil than their victims, and it's not even close. First, Madison's husband is mostly a mystery due to Madison's wholly unreliable narration, but since we know he likely hasn't murdered anyone, then I'd say it's safe to say that he's comfortably cleared the low bar being set by Madison and Gary. For Jasper, he's called a racist.
He's racist.
Even though almost everyone he works with is non-white, including his boss, and we never actually see any actual racism from him. And he got suspended for physically assaulting teenagers, but we never found out any further detail, and Jasper is adamant that it's not without cause. None of his colleagues ever correct him on this, and he was defended by the policemen's union.
If it weren't for the police union, you wouldn't even have a job right now. Who's that beating up those teenagers?
Oh, for no reason.
Maybe you've forgotten, Jasper. Unlike the 9 million other people who watch your video, but we got an angry public out there, and we don't want them in our business.
And either way, it's still not worse than murder. And then, as we know, he also attempts to blackmail Madison and Gary. Granted, this is not indicative of the usual upstanding Jasper that we all know and love, but it's still worlds away from multiple murders and being turned on by the slow suffocation of a long-term colleague happening 6 feet away from you.
Now I'm telling my friend about how you killed that guy.
It was for love.
Cool motive, still murder.
Throughout the entire film, the writers try their best to make the audience hate Jasper so that we remain unbothered by his murder, but they do a terrible job as he never comes close to being anywhere near as monstrous as our protagonists. His biggest crime for most of the runtime before he resorts to blackmail is simply being an arsehole, and even then, he's blackmailing a murderer and their accomplice, so, unlike in Bruges where our protagonists know they're awful people doing awful things, the protagonists in Hitman believe themselves to be good, and what's worse, so does the film. But there's another deviation which prevents Hitman from fitting into our Type 2 category of dark comedies, and that's the fact that it also doesn't fit the pattern of everything blowing up in the protagonist's faces like in It's Always Sunny. Linklater and Powell deny us the schadenfreude of seeing Gary and Madison get their comeuppance.
Why do bad things happen to good people?
And so we never get the satisfaction of feeling like there's a karmic balance occurring, which is usually pretty standard in comedy, even in dark comedy. Instead, the film seems to want us to think that Gary and Madison are good people who deservedly achieve a happy ending. Let's take a look at the final scene so you can see what I'm talking about.
Mommy, where did you meet Daddy?
Well, Daddy was the nicest guy I'd ever met, even though he was being all tough. I could tell it was an act.
And your mother, she ended up making a new man out of me.
No shit. It just wasn't for the better like the scene's tone would have you believe. By all accounts, she turned Gary from a thoughtful professor to a remorseless murderer. But rather than being played as the dark and gritty regression it should, the score would have us believe that this is a rom-com. I mean, let's just take another listen. Just on a related side note, this song is a cover of the original Cast Your Fate to the Wind, which was upbeat enough that it prompted the producer of the Peanuts comic strip to hire the musician Vince Guaraldi as a mainstay composer of the Charlie Brown cartoons. Not exactly the music of hyper-edgy dark comedy, and it's clearly not being used in this way in this film. This is framed as a purely happy moment with no moral conflict whatsoever. That this is viewed as a just and happy ending by both the writers and the critics, which we'll come to next, is morally baffling, and it only adds to the confused message and tone of the film. This leads us neatly into negatives of the meta, which focuses on the immorality of Hitman. Now, this is not a typical category for a film review, I'll grant you, but I feel Hitman is a special case in that it's based on a real-life person whose legacy the writers essentially spit on. There are various elements to the immorality of Hitman, so we'll take only a brief look at each in turn, as I'm sure you've already heard far too much about a film you're probably not that bothered about. First, immoral fiction. The first we can pretty much skip, as we've literally just covered it. Gary and Madison are awful people who never get a comeuppance, and the writers treat this as a positive. In short, the writer's moral perspective on their own characters is at best confusing and at worst despicable. Second, immoral critics. After watching the film, I wanted to check out what my betters thought of it, so naturally I flocked to the arbiters of truth and light, legacy media journalists. What I found, unsurprisingly, was a number of critics whose view of Hitman could not be more different than my own. For example, Cameron Barnett, Cameron with a Y, of Collider describes Hitman as having the tone of Ride Along. If he means that it's just as unfunny, then I'd somewhat agree, although I'd definitely give the edge to Ride Along, because there's absolutely no way he can mean that it's just as light-hearted, surely. Well, in the article he details how Hitman changes the details of some cases in order to retain the upbeat tone of the film. For example, Barnett writes, quote, "In order to maintain its more upbeat tone, Glenn Powell's Johnson is enlisted by a teenager, Monty, to murder his mum. In real life, this character is based off Houston teen Sean Quinn, who instead wanted Johnson to kill his classmate in exchange for computer games." End quote. So, let me get this straight. Collider here is making the point that a teenager committing matricide for not buying him games is just inherently more upbeat and less depressing than a teenager killing his classmate. Why? I mean, honestly, without any other context, I'd say killing your mum is worse than killing a peer you might only barely know. But in either case, why is Cameron here so convinced murdering one's mum is so much less evil and thus able to maintain a positive tone than murdering a classmate? It's really weird. What's more, Cameron goes on to describe how the real Gary Johnson's life ended differently to how it's portrayed in the film. Don't worry, we'll come to that next. But he uses the following description of events. Quote, "Instead of marrying the woman he helped save and going on to raise a loving family like in the movie." Wait, the woman he helped save? A loving family? Did you even watch the film, Cameron? As we've seen, there's no sense in which Madison needed to be saved. She was free to do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. And as for having a loving family, can a family consisting of two unempathetic, remorseless murderers ever really be described as loving? I mean, it's an interesting philosophical question, I suppose, but it's certainly not a cut and dry statement of fact as Cameron frames it here. And as if to put the immoral icing on the unethical cake, he concludes, quote, "Linklater's film is therefore not a strict retelling of Johnson's life so much as it is a reinvention of what could have been. By selectively choosing to focus on the most entertaining aspects of the man's career and spinning his personal life into a made-for-movie romance, Richard Linklater in Glenn Powell's script gives Johnson's legacy the grandiose treatment that his characters always imitated, paying their respects to the man by creating the same over-the-top narrative that always entrapped his clients. Using the power of storytelling to break new ground on a pre-existing biography, Linklater and Powell take a page out of Johnson's book beautifully, creating a happy ending for the man who chose not to end so many people's lives. What? So Linklater and Powell invented the life that, quote, could have been for the real Gary Johnson? You mean a life of murderous debauchery? Is this what the real Gary Johnson would have wanted? Really?
You sure about that? You sure about that? You sure about that?
And the fact Collider here perceives the ending as happy, just the way I suspected the filmmakers wished it to be perceived, confirms my take that both the filmmakers and many critics view this as just a simple rom-com, and the murders are just quirky hijinks from two star-crossed lovers. Before moving on, it's worth noting that Cameron's, quote, most enjoyable aspect of Hitman is the fun it has with Gary's aliases. This montage of personas happens between 19 minutes and 24 minutes 50 seconds. So Cameron's most enjoyable aspect of the film lasted for exactly 5 minutes and 50 seconds. This is out of a 1 hour, 55-minute movie. This is not to say that we can't have our favourite scenes in our favourite films, but Cameron doesn't describe this as his favourite scene, but his favourite aspect of the film. You do you, Cameron. Third, immoral writers. Now, the first two sections we've just covered can obviously be attributed to the writers anyway, but in this section I want to focus on two specific points. The in-universe rationalisation for the murders, and the twisting of a real person's life from one which was ultimately positive to one which is ultimately negative. First, we'll start with the writer's excuse for the murders, which I believe occurs in the following scene.
Let's jump back in time to our Paleolithic friends 25,000 years ago. This existential threat in the form of your unhinged leader. He's killing, he's raping, he's pillaging. Seems like he's gonna get you all killed. What are your options?
So Gary is asking his students how they solve a, quote, existential threat in the form of their group leader who is excessively violent in a situation in which they have no legal system and no means of exile or escape. The group responds,
"We're kind of mixed. Some of us think we should exile him.
We don't have the means to exile him. We're gonna put him on a boat?
The majority of us want to eliminate him. Whatever we have to do for our own survival."
Gary's response to the group decision then follows.
So how do you solve this problem? Execution. That's ruthless, but historically, potentially the right choice.
Gary's, quote, historically right choice comes just 2 short scenes before he agrees to cover up Madison's murder of her husband. And then, of course, only several scenes after that does he become a killer himself. I believe the writers inserted this scene as a background justification for Gary and Madison's cruel insanity. But this obviously doesn't work because they're not living in some thought experiment where there's no escape, no legal recourse, or no other option but to murder if they want to survive. They did not kill murderous tyrants, as Gary frames to his students in the lesson, but an ex-husband and a cop. They have plenty of options. They just choose murder because it's ultimately what they want. Or at least it gets them what they want. Finally, and in terms of Linklater and Powell's transformation of the real Gary Johnson's life from one of, by their own admission in the credits, loyal public servant and all-round decent man, to a selfish, unremorseful murderer who gets off on torture and death. When the credits rolled, I honestly couldn't believe the liberties they'd taken with this man's life. If Powell and Linklater had written Erin Brockovich's story, no doubt she'd have turned out to be a rogue employee of the pharmaceutical companies who was poisoning these families just for the fun of it. Just why? Erin Brockovich's story is interesting enough without making her a villain, and so is Gary Johnson's. Honestly, what they did here reminds me of a less bad version of Pain and Gain, a film which took real-life murderers and showcased them as goofballs who were just being silly. The tone here is very similar, and if there's any doubt as to the intent of the writers as I've described it here, let's just check out the following interview with Glenn Powell.
But the plot of the movie, it takes many twists and turns, and I'm not going to give away the ending. But I did find myself being surprised at myself that I'm rooting for things that go against everything I believe in. So what is wrong with me, Glenn?
Well, that's the magic trick of this. It's just really, we always conceptualize this as the beginning of a beautiful family, the beginning of a beautiful love story. You have to go on that ride, because if you really believe in love, sometimes love takes really unexpected, weird turns.
Yeah.
And love is not perfect.
Yes.
And this is definitely not a perfect love, but it's a beautiful story.
Not only does this provide more evidence that the critics, this one from CBS News, are in full support of the murderous protagonists, but co-writer and star himself, Glenn Powell, explicitly states that, quote, "We always conceptualize this as the beginning of a beautiful family, a beautiful love story. That love isn't perfect, but it's still a beautiful story." These people are fucking unhinged. We've seen this time and time and time again over recent years. This so-called Hollywood morality. The kind of morality that sees a woman in prison and tortured an entire town of men, women and children in order to maintain her psychotic delusion, only to be told that she's a hero for eventually letting them go.
They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
For me, Hitman is just another example of this iniquity shared by the Hollywood and media classes, and one which needs to be rectified if we're ever to see lovable characters on screen ever again. Ultimately, I just don't know what this film's going for. It's a comedy that's not funny, a romance between two people not deserving of love, and apparently an action film in which most of the action is seen in the bedroom. Ironically, for a film whose premise is an exploration of identity, Hitman doesn't have one of its own. We're going to finish off these reviews with some quick ratings of each important aspect of the film, including plot, world building, dialogue, characters, acting, direction, and finally, genre-specific elements. Note that since it's basically impossible to compare films from radically different genres, say teen rom-coms versus gritty gangster films, the ratings that follow essentially reflect ratings made within the standards set by the genre, and so a complex sci-fi plot may score the same as a really fun rom-com plot, because each may have accomplished its own goals successfully, even if the sci-fi plot is infinitely more complex. Now, onto the ratings. First, plot. The premise of Hitman is honestly great. The idea that we get to follow the wild and wacky antics of an undercover agent as he transforms through myriad personas to trick a variety of criminals who all have their own preconceptions of what a hitman should look and act like is brilliant. The additional fact that it's also based on a true story is even better, but unfortunately the execution is just awful. They turn what should be a fun, wacky adventure of a story into a drawn-out, morally repugnant pile of shite which wastes its core premise. 3.5 out of 10. Next, world building. This should be the easiest element to get right for a film like this. It's not a sci-fi galactic adventure or a highfalutin fantasy with its own physical laws spanning multiple dimensions. It's a relatively run-the-mill rom-com, or at least that's how the film's marketed. And so world building should be so straightforward that it almost doesn't even need to be considered. But as we've covered throughout this review, the film is so confusing you can never really be sure what the filmmakers want you to think about the plot, the people, the state of morality, even about whether neighbourhoods are rich or poor. Getting these basic facets right should be trivially easy, but Hitman fails at every turn. 2 out of 10. Next, dialogue. The dialogue between the characters coupled with Glenn Powell's narration is fine, but that's about the most I can say in support of it. It's relatively bland, and although it threatens to dive into deeper waters with its intended exploration of identity, threaten is all it does. And for a comedy, none of the lines or interactions are particularly funny. In fact, not remotely funny at all. 4.5 out of 10. For characters, this one is straightforward enough as it's easily the worst part of the film. The characterisation of our protagonists is deeply flawed. The writers and the actors think this is a sweet love story between two innocent star-crossed lovers who are just trying to be together in a world that won't let them. But as we've shown, this simply isn't true. This is You've Got Mail if Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan went on a killing spree. It's a genuinely baffling story filled with genuinely baffling characters who honestly make me think less of the writers, the director, and the actors for bringing them to life. 1 out of 10. Next, acting. While characterisation is the absolute worst part of Hitman, the acting is by far the best. Glenn Powell has seemingly come out of nowhere to now be found on every single screen in existence at all times. And to be fair to him, he did a good job with Hitman. I'm just disappointed that the film didn't demand more of him because I think he had more to give. And Adria Arjona as Madison was everything you could want in a femme fatale. Sexy, mysterious, and in this case, wildly unhinged. While our main man Jasper was played with an intense intrigue by Austin Emilio. Unfortunately, the duo that the film seems to be leaning on heavily for comedic support, Retta and Sanjay Rao, simply do not deliver. To be fair to them, it's not entirely their fault. And in fact, it's probably more to do with the writing than anything else. But either way, they're just not funny. 7 out of 10. Next, direction. The direction is a bit of a mixed bag. The cinematography gives us a nice looking film, a rich, warm tone from scene to scene with some nice shots to boot, all of which accompanies the feel of a typical rom-com. The problem is, Hitman isn't a typical rom-com. It's the portrayal of a pair of sadistic, murderous arseholes whom the writers want us to gush over, but since they're evil, the warm colour palette and soft, upbeat music just doesn't match at all. I'd suggest maybe that the writer and director had a breakdown of communication, but Richard Linklater was at the helm for both. Given that the direction is a mix of pleasing visuals and soundtrack, but applied to a woefully incompatible script, the rating is going to have to be quite low. 3.7 out of 10. Finally, genre specific. This is a category that we thought might give a little extra context to the ratings and allow films of any genre to shine. As stated earlier, you can't really compare a comedy to a horror as they've each got wildly distinct goals, and while plot and dialogue apply across all films, this category is all about whether each individual film really achieves its genre-specific goals. For Hitman, since it's billed as an action romantic comedy, it's this trifecta that it must hit. We've already discussed that it simply doesn't work as a rom-com. It's not funny, and the romantic leads are despicable monsters who should never find happiness. It's a genuine kick in the teeth that they do. As for action, I honestly don't even know where this label come from. It's got literally zero action, and so this category doesn't even apply. It gets half a point for the chemistry between Paul and Arjona, which is the only thing that contributes to any kind of romance in the film. 1.5 out of 10. Overall, that leaves us with a total score of 2.74 out of 10. Honestly, I think that's still being a bit too generous, but we'll leave it at that. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment, and all that good stuff. We'll see you next time. Ta-ra.